everybody to this search for a theology that speaks to today's People's Forum, and to just briefly introduce you to our four guests, for those of you who don't know. We've got on my far right Eugene Stockton, Catholic priest and long-time seminary lecturer and author of The Deep Within, Towards an Archetypal Theology. And we've got Peter Todd, research psychologist at the Neuropsychiatric Institute in Sydney and author of The Individuation of God. And then on my far left, we've got Karen Treston, author of Emergence for Life, Not Fall from Grace, Making Sense of the Jesus Story in the Light of Evolution. And right by me, we've got Dr. David Tacey from La Trobe University, whose books include Re-Enchantment, The Spirituality Revolution, and Gods and Diseases. So let's begin with the question posed by the first video: where has God gone in people's lives today? The idea being that the church is visibly dying on its feet, particularly in the West anyway, with ageing congregations and so on, and we're asking why. Now, let me begin with Karen Treston. Karen, in your book you say that history will look back at the late 20th century as a defining era in the evolution of consciousness. What happened and why?
I think a number of things, obviously, just briefly. First of all, the enormous change scientifically, quantum physics and, all the different things that have happened, ecological issues, Big Bang and cosmology and depth psychology and so on. So the human consciousness, I'm talking briefly about the West for a moment, shifted to a new understanding, a new level. And then there were big challenges from, the atheist movement and the science question and the gap between religion and science that really opened up in a way, and yet I see movements towards its coming together at one level. I mean, there are many things I could say, but they're just some of the themes I've seen.
David, you say that we need to examine our assumptions about people even ever coming back to church, because it ain't going to happen. And we have to go right back to the beginning to think about the sort of social and cultural issues around where God got to.
Yes, a lot of people say to me, young people aren't attending Mass, and older people aren't showing up either, and when they're going to come back. And I tend to think of that as delusional thinking. I don't think that we really realise how dramatic this shift is, and that the whole notion of what religion meant for such a long time is basically finished. And we have to reconfigure what religion means, and I think it is important, but I think that taking up Kevin's point, I think the shift, the gap between science and religion, which Peter will talk about in a minute, it's an illusion. There's only a wide gap if we take religion literally. If we take the stories literally, then of course they don't reconcile with science. But if we take them metaphorically, which so many theologians, scripture scholars, like Karen Armstrong, like John Dominic Crossan, like John Spong, have been telling us for decades not to read these stories literally. And when we suddenly realise that the true dimension of our religious story is metaphorical, then, Kevin, there's no clash with science, because the science story and the religion story can happily coexist. So this is the paradigm shift that I see.
Should we be thinking about something, David, beyond science being an issue? I mean, for example, I'm very interested in the role that the two world wars played. The belief disintegrated in a sense with the First World War, and the Americanization of the planet, and the birth of consumerism and individualism with the Second World War. Are massive shifts that the fallout from those two world wars we don't even think about so much anymore, but it's still all happening.
Still all happening. The two world wars were decisive. Also decisive were the two sexuality revolutions. The revolution in the 1920s, which my parents participated in.
Just briefly tell us.
Well, I mean, you know, the roaring 20s, you know,
Right.
the idea that sexuality was no longer seen as evil, as we'd been told for so long in the church, but we could actually celebrate our vitality and experience it in different ways. And then the era I went through, which was the 1960s, well, you see, really, I'm baby boomer. I was born in 1953, straight after the Second World War, and I think I'm pretty much the last generation that attended church. Certainly my daughters, for instance, although had Catholic upbringings and Catholic schools, the idea of them going to Mass regularly just doesn't appear on their radar. They just said, Dad, this is not what we do, and don't expect us to do it. So these massive changes. However, we shouldn't get mournful about this, because I think we'll discuss how God and religious sensibility is still present, but not in the old ways.
Peter, science, but what else?
Well, I think many people have a mistaken idea of science. I think a lot of the world is still caught in the classical Newtonian mechanistic view of science, which dehumanises human beings, in fact, which exorcise psyche and spirit from the whole equation of existence. And I think what we might be looking for is a sense of the numinous, because I think there is a universal quest for spirituality, and an encounter with the numinous needs to be compatible with developments in science in the 20th century, particularly, as the other two speakers have mentioned, developments in quantum physics and depth psychology, where in the collaboration, for instance, between Carl Jung and the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, their collaboration was all about re-importing mind into quantum physics and into science.
Well, we're going to talk about that at length later on. Let me ask you another question, and that is, you know, we've touched on a range of things that are external to the story of religion, things that were bearing down on religious belief. But to what extent do you think the churches themselves played some role in this widening gulf, you know, and the falling away of participation?
Well, with all due respect to religious institutions and to the church, of which I'm a member, I wanted to be a Jesuit once. I think a large amount of the responsibility belongs with the church and with groups like the Magisterium, because they've tried to perpetuate a theology that's predicated upon this notion of an anthropomorphic God external to creation rather than intrinsic to the evolutionary process and emerging from it in us, such that, as Julian Huxley and Todd both said, humankind finds itself in the position of being business managers for the whole of cosmic evolution.
So the image of God is out of date?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's more within, as Tower would say, it's more immanent in evolution rather than extrinsic to it.
What do you think about that, Eugene?
I'm not really at home with physics. I read the headlines, but I don't know the detail. Going back to our original question, I'd like to take an anthropological approach. I'm more at home there. What has changed is the change of culture. Now, we distinguish between the church and Christendom. Christendom, as I understand it, is a religious culture. It's the sort of thing that in pre-Reformation Europe produced, you know, glorious cathedrals, glorious music, and so on, all the arts, the expression of that religious culture. We used to talk about Catholic Ireland. Now, what was happening in Ireland was that there was religion was almost the air that you breathed, and everyone went along to church because that was the done thing. It was easy to follow one's religion when your whole culture was supporting that. And I think in a number of countries, not only Catholic countries, that culture has changed a lot in the 20th century. And putting it politically, I think the onslaught of capitalism is very much here. So now we have a lot of people who are no longer supported by the general culture. Think of culture as a sort of an atmosphere, the air that we breathe, or for the fishes in the sea, what the sea means. Take that away and people lose those natural supports. So people who are following their religion now do so because they want to, not because they're supported by this atmosphere. And I'd say today our smaller numbers in church represent something very significant. I think there are more saints today than there have ever been. Now I have contact with people in the parish here and others I've been in, and I'm astounded that you look at those people in detail and there is a commitment, there is a real belief in Jesus Christ. There's a commitment they want to follow that through. And so I think there are more saints now than there have ever been.
Do you think possibly, Eugene, you know, Terry Eagleton, the great English culture critic, wrote recently that, in fact, I think it was in a review of Dawkins's infamous book, that Christianity had been the richest and most enduring form of popular culture in human history. And I wonder whether we need to be entirely negative about it. Are we actually, in a sense, still swimming in a Christian fishbowl, even if we can't sort of see what's holding us up? Are we living on Christian capital? Are we, in a sense of, has our generation maybe and the modern period with education and so on absorbed Christianity into its DNA? Perhaps even more than at any time in the past.
But now people have to deliberately intend to follow their Christianity. You know, there's a famous saying by Karl Rahner that the time is coming when a Christian will be a mystic or nothing. Now, that's often quoted, but it's not always noted the context in which he said that. And he made that in the context of remarking how in Europe, as he knew it, this Christian culture was passing away, and which meant that in the future people would have to stand on their own feet. And he speaks about mysticism, he speaks about the ordinary experience of God. It doesn't mean to say people having visions and so on, but people do experience God in small ways and constant ways. And, you know, you see it in the people who devote themselves to works of charity, social justice and things like that. There's a lot more of that than there was in the past. And I'm really amazed at what we... And even, you know, it's an ordinary thing now for people to be mystics. I suppose that pretty well every parish has its meditation group, which they would never have thought of in the days when, you know, we had lots of priests and nuns and brothers and so on.
What fascinates me about this, Eugene and Stephen, is that I've recently reread the last book in the Bible, the book of Revelation, which is a very difficult book to read, only to discover that there are no churches in the New Jerusalem. No churches. Yeah. And the idea of St. John of the Divine, who wrote that, is that the idea is that the Christian ethos had penetrated so broadly across the community that there was no need to segment off a little section of it. And I think that's what you were kind of getting at in a way, that somehow or other we might be moving toward, believe it or not, this kind of New Jerusalem situation where the world becomes the temple.
And the intermediary institution isn't required anymore.
Isn't required. And I think, and coming back to Eugene's important work on Aboriginal spirituality, when before white people arrived, the whole of Australia was a cathedral. They didn't need to build cathedrals because the whole landscape was their cathedral. And I think Eugene's work has been very important in showing that that really is an important direction for our future, to really understand this.
Peter?
I'd like to take up what the other speakers and what you, Eugene, particularly have said in terms of mysticism being the way of the future. My understanding of the incarnation of God is that God became human in an evolutionary process in order that we might participate in God and in the further unfolding of the numinous. And where I most personally have experienced that, aside from my own near-death experience, has been sitting at the deathbeds of people terrified of dying from diseases like HIV/AIDS and needing some sort of sense of what self-continuity might be like, and is there something to sustain me through this which might or might not correspond to what the Church is telling us. But I think we do need a new redefinition or understanding of the whole incarnation, that is inclusive of us and not just as an historical event.
And that's why too the whole ecological, cosmological issue with paleontology about the evolution of the human person is so critical today, because I don't think dogmatic you can tell really. I wonder if you can tell any religious story apart from the great overarching story of the universe 13.6 billion years ago, and all what happened and how everything developed, because that's the context. Our cosmic parents are stardust, really.
Right.
And
well, I mean, we're going to talk about this idea of religion and health in the very last of our conversations, and we're going to talk about this idea of storytelling in conversation number 4. So we'll come back to those ideas. Let's just pick up on a couple of little threads that I think are worth dealing with now and before we move on. One is the issue of declining participation generally, David. My colleague at the ABC, John Cleary, used to always say that 1963, the year I was born, 50 years ago, is the year when participation and membership of clubs and membership societies generally peaked. And there was a steady decline after 63. In other words, there's a problem in all of this that isn't intrinsically just about religion. There's a more general issue going on. Would you sort of enlighten us about that?
Oh, I think that's a sociological issue that John Cleary, as you say...
But what's behind it? What's causing it?
Well, I think what's behind it is an unwillingness to become a subscribed, paid-up member of something. I mean, I've got children and I've got students, and the last thing they want to do is become a member of anything. They want to... They don't... See, my generation were very happy up until about mid-1960s to become members of this and members of that and sign on. But now I think there's a new metaphor governing society.
Is urbanisation driving it? What is it, living in big cities? What's the problem?
It's not just that, it's interconnectivity, it's the internet, it's the social media, it's mobile phones. I think there's a complete sense now, and I know all the speakers on this panel can attest to this, that we're moving to a new stage of consciousness, which is not about being part of a club anymore and being part of a tribe. You know, when I was a kid, you were part of the Catholic tribe and you hated the Protestants because they were in another tribe. And, you know, and now all that stuff doesn't matter anymore. I mean, it's beautiful. I mean, in a sense, you know, it mattered so much. They used to fight each other in the streets. You know, Catholic versus Protestant means nothing in Australia anymore. So because that sense of tribalisation has been replaced by the metaphor of interconnectivity, you know, and all the big companies have these slogans that they only connect or connect through us. All these things like, you know, Telstra and Optus, they're all selling connectivity. And what's at the basis of it is a new understanding of what it means to be human.
Would you agree, David, however, that connectivity in and of itself is not interconnectedness or mystical connection of human beings on a global scale?
Absolutely. And I think what we're being sold by the companies is an ersatz version of all this.
Absolutely.
What's behind it, Peter, I think, is this desire for a unio mystico, as they used to say, you know, the one world.
Yes.
And even when you fly Qantas, it says welcome to one world. So all the companies, all the commercial industries are talking about this oneness. They're cashing in on it. That's not the real thing. The real thing is, of course, what I think we're moving toward. Kevin writes about this in his recent book. We are moving to a stage of unitary consciousness. You call it integral consciousness, I think.
And a key thing, I think, in view of the vast issues we're facing of ecological and climate change and population, all that there, I'm not sure if we can resolve them unless we move to another level of consciousness, because the questions they ask are profound questions. Like just in population, we're 7 billion now, 9 billion in 80 years, and we need a new consciousness about resources and earth care and a whole lot of things to deal with that.
Eugene, it strikes me that the God our society really worships is increasingly the image we see in our bathroom mirrors every morning.
God forbid.
The age of narcissism.
And that's getting bleaker, Stephen.
Yes.
I think there's something quite deep in this. I read a fair bit about Meister Eckhart, and it's interesting how Meister Eckhart develops the idea of the transcendent deity, the Godhead. When he speaks about the Godhead, he means the Godhead even before the Trinity, if you like to put it that way. And it's interesting that he speaks about the human being. He uses the same terms for the person, what in my books I call the I, this unknowable, unknown thing. I don't know who I am or what I am. I just know that there's an I that is responsible for all my activities and my knowledge and so on. But when I try to get closer to that, it's an unknown, it's unmanifest, to use Hindu ideas. And he projects that then to our knowledge of God, that in God there is this unmanifest, this unknowable I, even before there's three persons. And so I think there's, and of course, people like Augustine, for example, he understood the Trinity in terms of the human understanding. I think it's natural that we do this, because the I is the most mysterious thing in this whole universe. I don't know who I am. I just know that I am. And because of that mysteriousness of the I tend to project that and say, well, at least God must be like that, if not more.
Well, so I think, idea of God made in man's image.
And I think it's a natural process that we, if you like, there are two poles. There's the I of me, and then the I of God. And before we know anything about God, like Trinity and so on. So I don't think it's such a deleterious thing that we project onto God what we think about ourselves. It is mystery. That's the important thing.
Augustine's famous quote, when you say that is God, that is not God, you know, because it's unknowable. So we can only use symbolic language to try and express the mystery.
I think if we project our own image too much onto God, with the danger is that there'll be an eclipse of God, as Freud suggested.
David, back to science a little bit with this question. Is part of the crisis for dogmatic religion coming out of the idea that all truth is relative? Is that one of the big issues? And I don't just mean relativity in the Einstein sense. I mean the massive cultural shift that probably didn't come from Einstein, but has come as much as anything else from globalisation and mass communications and post-colonialism, the sense that other people have a story that's equally valid, the sense that there's constant change in our world today that's fundamental, that there aren't just static truths that just shine on for all time, that things are constantly in flux. How much of that is an issue?
It's hugely responsible for the unsettlement of religion at the moment. I mean, when I grew up as a kid, we used to have a saying in the church in Latin, which in English meant there's no salvation outside the church. Do you remember that? I mean, I actually believed that.
Nihil salus extra ecclesia.
Yeah, that's right. I used to believe that. And then, of course, I met Hindu kids and Buddhist kids, and, of course, growing up in Alice Springs, I met Aboriginal kids who were part of Indigenous, and I started to think, this is unbelievable. There's no salvation outside the church. Not unless we perhaps redefine what church means. Mate, church is the whole world in this kind of New Jerusalem sense that I have encountered recently. But I think there's a great fear in the church that relativity means relativism, and I think that this is an important point. Relativity simply means that there are a number of different nodal points of truth, each of which can stand and have validity and integrity. Now, when that becomes relativism, that means that none of them are true. So a lot of people think, well, if there are many truths, none of them can be true. But this isn't right. This is not the way we have to think. We've got to think about the world as like the Hindu idea of Indra's net, having little spikes of little jewels, and each of those jewels in the hologram of the world have integrity and meaning. So that relativity shouldn't necessarily be the great demon that a lot of more conservative people in the churches think it is. And those of us in Christianity should celebrate the fact that there are other pathways to God, instead of fearing them and saying, no, those other pathways are wrong.
One more question on science, and that is this, that science filters into popular culture in all kinds of different and unexpected ways. I studied when I was at university the poetry of John Donne, the great English metaphysical poet, who was the Dean of St Paul's.
That's right.
Whose poetry is absolutely focused on the fact that the Earth is no longer at the centre of the universe, and now the sun is, and everything's gone. And he uses it in all kinds of wonderful creative ways.
He's a very erotic poet as well.
Absolutely. It occurs to me that far more important in popular culture than Darwinian evolution or the new physics, the Big Bang and so on, is the political PR catastrophe ongoing, now 400 years old, of the Galileo trial.
Well, I think one of the great problems of Galileo is that began a schism between spirit and matter science and religion that lasted 400 years.
That's what I'm really getting at, the fact that that event, perhaps more than anything else, creates the kind of social and cultural sense amongst people of education and science that the church persecutes knowledge and rationality.
Yes.
When in fact that actually,
Dawkins.
if you go back into the medieval period, that had not been the case. Christianity had always been a very rational, thoughtful, it had run the universities. You get what I'm talking about?
But also I think Descartes, così Deo ergo sum, I think therefore I am, that separation of matter and spirit also was valuable in terms of opened the Enlightenment to investigate and all that science and so on, but it created that dangerous thing that the spirit and matter were separate. And one of the movements that I find encouraging today in depth psychology, and so much of that in the new theories of mind, matter and so on, is we're trying to bring the matter and spirit together. And if we can do that, I think religion can have a great appeal, provided people don't get caught, into dogmatism and so on.
Can I just add one line to that? That quantum physics and depth psychology both lead to holism and interconnectedness, rather than this schism and splitting, which we get fed on the media. Science, as we're fed it on the media, is still very much the pre-quantum model.
Well, we're going to talk about that later. Let me just ask you all one last question. Nietzsche declares the death of God in 1882. And there's this famous passage. And I always think people overlook the second part of the passage. And this is what Nietzsche says. It's such genius. What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed, having killed God, too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Now, it seems to me he's saying something very interesting there, that we can't live without God, possibly, even though we've killed him. The work of God continues on even without God, in a sense. That we have to invent God, or we have to invent a spirituality or some sense of the sacred to take the place of God. Now, two questions. Are we, in a sense, hardwired? I hate that term, but let me use it because we all know what it means. Are we, in a sense, hardwired for God and religious belief, Eugene?
Paul Davies wrote a very interesting book called The Mind of God. And it's interesting that the title is actually a takeoff from Stephen Hawking's what's the History of Time?
Short History of Time.
And this final sentence was that when we have the theory of everything, then we will know the mind of God, which sounds like a supreme hubris. And Paul Davies takes that and shows, tells the story of a number of scientists who are all mystics, that their science has led them into a mystical experience. And I think that's shows an interesting development within our world, that we no longer can hope for a theory of everything, and that the mind of God is actually attained by a different route.
David, do we have a need for something spiritual? Do we hanker after, even if it's not God, a sense of the transcendent? Do we have to fill a space that we've created, a void that we've created?
A few years ago, the BBC in London did a survey called The Soul of Britain, because they were asking this very question, Stephen. What do British people believe? We haven't had the soul of Australia yet, but hopefully we have a soul, and we'll explore it. Most people, when asked, do they believe in God, said no. And the reason they said no is because Nietzsche's God died. When Nietzsche announced the death of God, I think what happened there were two things. One, the anthropomorphic God that was invented in human image had to die, because it was blocking, as it were, our path to the sacred. This is a very odd thing to say. But atheism can, I think, Stephen, serve faith. In fact, Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, says atheism is a stage of faith. It's the stage of faith where you turn away from cliched and stereotypical images of God, which are completely unrealistic, and then reopen what Eugene calls the mystery, and then experience the true God. And that's
was
why,
it you in your essay just the other day for Catholica?
Yeah.
Was it you saying that, in a sense, atheism is the right religious answer for these times?
I actually think it is. I mean, when people go, "Oh my God, the world's becoming atheistic," I actually have this term in my own mind, holy atheism, and I see it as very similar to the Catholic tradition of the via negativa, the negative theology. That is to say, we can't believe in
that anymore.
No, in that anymore.
Right.
And that's what Nietzsche's saying.
Right.
And
until some other
yes,
image comes along,
that's right.
This is the right answer in the meantime.
And I think your point about Nietzsche was so important. That is, everybody knows the first bit of that statement, that God is dead, but who knows the second bit, which is that how do we replace this? Do we understand how huge the death of God really is? We're wiping away the horizon, says Nietzsche. We have to have something. I don't like hardwired either, but I think put it this way, the sacred is ineradicable. We are built, I think, in the image of God, but continually religions put up images that they create.
Well, can I be very provocative and suggest to you that a very well-known neuroscientist called Ramachandran and others have come up with a term called neurotheology, which rather suggests to me, because I've worked a number of years in the neurosciences, that we are in a sense hardwired, and that the God that Nietzsche killed off, as you're quite rightly saying, was the old anthropomorphic God. But that doesn't mean we can't experience God in a mystical way.
And in fact, to be quite honest, I mean, Eugene said earlier that we've never had a time of so many saints, but not all these saints are religious people. I find that I work in a university with about 25,000 people. There are some saints there, and they're all atheists. So, no, I'm serious, But in other words, they're atheists because why? Well, because they've rejected that other stuff that is no longer believable. That doesn't mean they're not receptive to the sacred and to the new experience of God.
That's why the creeds were so difficult. You needed sort of creeds, if I could just take there. But the problem is they were just markers on the way, Trent or whatever. And the moment that the creeds become absolutized and people get locked into the words, all the creeds have a great historical context, like the Nicene Creed, and unless you know that, it's unintelligible, actually. So the moment that we absolutize words, and don't go to the heart of the question, the soul of the question. Therefore, I just so much agree with what David is saying, that I believe there's a great, inner yearning for something, but I have great problems with often the language that's used, and the sooner we get rid of a lot of the language, the better.
John of the Cross talked of a divine absence in his Dark Night of the Soul, and I think he was in an atheistic stage then, even though he was a great
and
mystic.
this is where I think society is at the moment. I didn't finish my story about the soul of Britain. People said, no, there's no God, but there is something there. And so one of my colleagues in Britain has published a book recently called Something There. And he says, it's the something there that's the future. That's the future. That's the hope.
Right.
People feel this.
Can I read you a little passage? One of my great heroes is the great Jewish New York literary critic Harold Bloom, who I think he has so many tiny little chips of wonderful wisdom. He wrote that great, Where Shall Wisdom Be Found? He wrote a book about Jesus and Yahweh, the names divine, a few years ago. This is a passage. I repeat that the future of Christianity is not in Europe or the Middle East, but in the United States, Africa and Asia. This coming Christianity is dominated by Jesus and the Holy Spirit rather than by the figure of the Father. A pragmatic separation between Yahweh and Jesus widens, and Yahweh has not survived in Christianity, but only in the Allah of Islam. The dying God has turned out to be Yahweh and not Jesus. All God's age, Yahweh included, though his dying may not prove to be final since Islam could yet prevail. God ebbs with continental economies, and Europe's augmenting godlessness could be a symptom of its final decline in relation to globalisation. Now, I think that's a very interesting idea that gods grow old, and he's on about something that you've been talking about. This idea that we've kind of surpassed or used as much as we can from an old image.
My grandfather used to sit me on his knee when I was about 8, and he'd said, David, we've had the era of God the Father, that's Judaism. We're just coming out of God the Son, which is Christendom, and we're about to enter the field of the God of the Holy Spirit. And he said, it's the least known member of the Trinity. Most people have images of God the Father. Most people have images of God the Son. But who knows about God the Holy Spirit?
Yeah. And Harvey Cox, in the Future of Religion, he talks about this.
Future of Faith.
Future of Faith. He moves about from the faith time to the belief era, and now the era of the Spirit, or he calls it different things. And he believes the belief era is ending because it's time.
And that's where Rana comes in, because Rana said the future Christian will be a mystic, or he or she will not be at all. And I think this is a very important... When I first read that, I thought, this is outrageous. Yes. But it's actually it's what's going to happen.
I think the survival of the earth depends upon it.
Yeah. My friend who's a panicker reminded me that Panicker said that 30 years before Rana did. So it's interesting.
Let's move on to our second video, which is all about the challenges of rationalism and science, which we've been touching on.
Breath of Creator, essence of stardust.